Hello. It's time for our devotional today. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm a little under the weather. I think I mentioned it. I'm a little under the weather. Got a cold. So if I start coughing in the middle of this, I apologize. I don't have a mute button. I'm not that high tech. I've got a mic up here, and I don't think there's a mute button on it. If I cough, I apologize. Um, Anyways, I'm going to try and get through this. We're looking at Proverbs chapter 5, verse 20 today. And we're just going to dive right into that. We've been working our way through this book of the Bible, one verse at a time. I think it's really important just to remind people that. I'm sorry, I know I do it a lot, but I just in case a person's grabbing this video without looking at any of the others in the series, we're just working through the book of Proverbs in the Bible, one verse at a time. Now, sometimes those verses are part of a flow of thought, and for much of the book of Proverbs, there's just single statement verses. But for these early chapters, they're part of a flow of thought. And so to understand the verse, you have to kind of understand the verses around it, very, very much have to understand the verses around it. So I just want to highlight that a little bit. This verse 20, is in the middle of chapter 5, which is a whole chapter kind of devoted to this idea of it's written to a young man to be faithful to his wife and not to commit adultery or to go into an affair of some sort, but be faithful to your wife. And so speaking about that, the ideas are transferable to other things, but that's the specific topic. And in particular with regard to sexuality in marriage. And so the whole chapter really focused on that aspect of marriage, is that have your sexual satisfaction with your wife, not with someone who isn't your wife. And so as it goes down through that, it talks about things like the bad outcomes and the regret you'll feel if you go that way, and so on and so forth. And it gets down to verse 20. And verse 20, I've mentioned in previous videos, I believe, but in Hebrew poetry, which is originally written in Hebrew, and it's kind of poetic, often what happens is they will make parallel statements. And it'll be the first part of the statement and the second part of the statement are like parallels of each other or contrasts to each other in order to make a point. So there's a lot of doubling. Sometimes there'll be two statements that themselves parallel each other, and verse 19 and verse 20 are like that. Excuse me. Verse 19 says, so I'm going to read it again as I read it yesterday, and you can look at yesterday's video for more on that. But it says, as a loving hind and a graceful doe. Now it's using the image of the deer, right? Hind is a type of deer. It's talking about his wife, and he says, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. So there's a parallel. Let her breast satisfy you. Be exhilarated with her love. But then in verse 20, that whole idea itself is then kind of contrasted. And so in verse 20, which is today's verse, it says, for why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner, right? So the contrast to let her breasts satisfy you, right? Embrace the bosom of a foreigner, right? Or be exhilarated with her love is contrasted by exhilarated with an adulteress. And so we just see this contrasting statement where the author is saying to his son, find your, as we talked about yesterday, find your sexual satisfaction with your wife, and find your sexual satisfaction with your wife. And by contrast, why would you not? Why would you go for this same experience with someone who isn't your wife? Why would you do that? Now it's spoken here in kind of a rhetorical sense of, not really asking the question, more or less making the statement of there's no good reason to do that. But it asks as a question, why would you do this? Why should you do this? Why should you do this? And it's an interesting question. Even though it's rhetorical, making the statement, it's a good question. Why do people do this? Why do people turn away from their wife to find some form of satisfaction to their sexual desires, whether it be through adultery, which is terrible, of course. It's breaking of the covenants, violation of trust. It's all kinds of bad things. Or even just other things where maybe you didn't actually go out with someone and do something, but maybe there was a lustful pattern that was developed in your life where you're being exhilarated through pornography or through lustful thoughts of someone in your life, some coworker or something, and you're allowing your mind to go somewhere where you're arousing sexual interest in someone who isn't your wife. Why do people do that? Well, there's a number of suggested reasons. I'll suggest a couple here. I think sometimes it's a form of self care. And not really self-care, but a term we use, what do they call it? Self-soothing. It's like the reason people get addicted to drugs or alcohol or so even just coffee. There's something about satisfying a basic or instinctual appetite that causes people to feel a form of comfort. And so sometimes people learn to find some kind of comfort in arousing their sexual appetite. I know that sounds weird, but that's a thing. And it's a thing that most of us will experience with something in life, whether it be lust or whether it be gluttony or whether it be whatever. Sometimes that's the reason. There's an emotional hunger of sorts that occurs inside you. And to satisfy it, you actually arouse the hunger for the thing, whatever the thing is. And so in this case, perhaps lust. And it's not really very good, but that's one of the reasons people do it. Others, I guess, sometimes it can happen because people are just kind of self-entitled. They're self-important. They think, it's I have a right to this, or I deserve this, or it's my nature, or some sort of excuse they use, and they basically bring on themselves an entitlement of something, and they think that this pleasure is something they could or should have, and so then they go off looking for it everywhere and anywhere. Why not restrict themselves to their wife, though? Why would they go elsewhere? And I'm going to suggest in all of these things I'm saying that the center of it is self, right? The last one is self-satisfaction. Sometimes people go looking for lust in other places because they're just trying to find a way to satisfy a very, very active appetite. And so that self-satisfaction, maybe they don't feel they're getting enough at home or something like that. And so then they go looking for it elsewhere. Now, none of these are excuses. None of them are, but people use them as if they're excuses, but they're not. God designed marriage as the place to satisfy the sexual drive of a human being. That's where it's supposed to happen. Now, if you say, well, my marriage is not being satisfied, well, the question then is, why not? It's not necessarily because your partner isn't as frequent as you. It's not necessarily that. It could have more to do with this emotional thing that's going on inside of ourselves, where we put ourselves and our so-called needs at the center of everything. And we want to have that need met without cost. And that's the part that's really dangerous. We want it without cost. See, marriage is costly. Marriage is you binding yourself to someone, unifying yourself with someone, excluding others, and committing to more than just a sexual experience, whole life with that person. There's a cost involved in that. And even the sexual act has a certain level of cost to it. You have to, you have to kind of seduce one another, and there's a process in that, and there's a respect for that, and so on that has to happen. And when people go outside of the marriage union to try and satisfy that, then they're looking to get the satisfaction without any cost. Pornography, of course, is really designed this way. No cost, or at least they think there's no cost. I would suggest there actually is a huge cost. But they think there's no cost, but they can find a way to satisfy the hunger. So anyways, so that this video doesn't go too long, I'll leave that there, and you can explore that idea a little bit further on your own. But it's a lie. This is where I want to get with this. It's a lie. Excuse me. The cost, or at least some of the cost of pursuing this outside of marriage, is that the self actually becomes everything. Just as I mentioned earlier, the self is the reason that drives so much of it. It grows. When you invest in whatever you invest in, it increases. If you invest in yourself, the selfness increases. If you invest in the union of your marriage, then the union of that marriage increases. The cost of going outside of your marriage to get this free satisfying of your sexual desires is that you will increasingly worship yourself. You will have less and less self-control. You will have increased self-degradation. You will respect yourself less, and you will be less respectable. The cost to yourself is in all kinds of very subtle and maybe not always obvious ways, but it really is there. And your personhood becomes degraded. The result is an increase in self and a lack of union with other humans, which means an increase in loneliness. And this is why some people could have, sexual experiences with dozens and dozens of women and still feel extremely lonely. They're having, in theory, they're having intimacy with dozens of women, but they feel extremely alone because what they've increased is self, not union, self. And so there's more of self and less of others. That's a lonely thing. And that's one of the big costs. There's other costs as well, but that's one of the big costs. But the wonderful thing in a marriage is if you invest in your marriage and you invest in the union with your wife, that union gets increased. And if you satisfy your sexual desire with your wife and invest in that relationship, then the self diminishes and the two of you increases. And then you actually have less loneliness, you have greater union. And it's a really wonderful thing. This is one of the reasons why, as I was speaking yesterday, in a good Christian marriage, sex should be part of that because it's actually an investment in your union. And so that's a good thing for improving your marriage and improving even yourself. Anyway, that's complex. I'm sick, so hopefully I'm not just rambling here. I'll leave it at that. The key here today is, as the verse says, basically stating in the form of a question, don't seek sexual arousal with someone you're not in union with. Don't embrace sex with someone who's a foreigner, right? A stranger that you don't have a union with. Have sex be truly an intimate thing with your wife. That's the idea. Anyways, God, please help all of us do this, in not just physically, but in our minds as well. Pray in Jesus' name. Now, tomorrow we'll come back for verse 21. These last three verses of chapter 5 are going to talk about how God watches over our unions and what's involved there. So we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day. God bless.